Greetings, let's do a solution to problem 8 and problem 9. So the context here is the same. We've got an array list of integers that represents an audio sample, and we want to write static methods that do things with that audio sample. So one of them adds leading silence, which is represented by zeros, and the other extracts some subsample of the actual sample. All right, I've created a little testing setup here. So I have an array list called sample that I've already filled with 100 random numbers. And then here is the method for problem 8, and here's the method for problem 9. So I'll go ahead and create the method for problem 8. It doesn't really matter for now if it's public or private, but I'll make it public. So, and I just want to make sure that my parameter names are named something intelligent. So sample is a fine one for this one, but this I'm going to call length because it represents the length of the leading silence. So the number of zeros to have at the beginning of the list. All right, in my problem statement, notice it says that I'm supposed to return a copy of sample. So the very first thing I want to do inside here is make another list that's going to be the copy of the input list. So if I'm making a new list, I'll say array list, integer, and I'll call this one return sample. You can't do this. You can't say equals sample. Because this isn't actually making a new list. All this is doing is sample is what's called a reference because it's sort of like a pointer that points back to this actual list that I made up here. So what I'm doing is I'm saying I want this variable to be the same reference as this variable. So this doesn't actually make a new list that's a copy. All this does is I say I want another name that also points at the same thing that this points at. If that doesn't make sense right now, don't worry about it. We're going to be going over it in a lot more detail once the class begins. But the important thing to take away is this is not making another list. If you want to make another list, you actually have to say new array list. Okay, so now I've got a new array list. If I want it to be a copy, I'm just going to have to copy every single value over one at a time. So let's do that. I equals 0, I is less than sample.size, I plus plus. And then here I'll say return sample.add. So I'm adding a number, and the number that I'm adding is going to be sample.getI. I have compressed this into one line. If you wanted to, of course, you could do this. You could say num equals. So I get out the number first, and then I add it into my copy. That's the same thing. It doesn't really matter to me which one you do. All right, so far so good. So I have made my copy list, but I haven't inserted the leading zeros yet. So you got two choices. One thing you could do is you could insert the leading zeros here before you copy over the rest of the things. That's what would make them leading zeros because they would be at the beginning of the list because you haven't put in the rest of the list yet. I'm going to instead pretend that I already have this list and I'm going to insert them at the beginning, because this is more similar to what some of you tried and failed to do. Some people did this. They have their return sample list, and they said return sample.add 0, oops, not add all, .add 0, and they have a loop that will do this however many times they need it to happen. So I is less than length, I plus plus. So this is now looping this many times, length times, and I'm adding a whole bunch of zeros, but I'm not adding them to the beginning, I'm adding them to the end, because .add automatically adds them to the end of the list. Something they test you on in the AP test is the fact that there are two different add methods for the array list data type. Just add with one parameter adds it to the end of the list, but if you do dot and then type add and you hover for a minute, you see that there's this other one, add, which expects two inputs. The first is the index and the second is what you're trying to insert at that index. So here I want to insert it at index 0, and the thing that I want to be inserting there is a 0. So now this is going to add a whole bunch of zeros, but I'm inserting them at index 0, which would be the beginning of the list instead of the end. All right, so now I can return my return sample list, and that's the end. All right, let's do problem 9. So problem 9, I will create the method and I will make it public. and I will make sure my parameters are named something intelligent. So what were they supposed to be? In number 9, right, start and end. So I'll call this one start, and I'll call this one end. And again, I want to return a new array list that contains the values starting at start and ending at end. You might be wondering, do I include the value that is this ending index, or do I do all the numbers up to the ending index but not including that end? And my example shows you here, if this was the array and you're going from index 2 to index 7, this is index 0, 1, 2, so you're starting with index 2, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so this is index 7, and sure enough, that number is included in the expected output. So this example has answered my question, which is, do you include this last index? And the answer is yes. By the way, this is exactly what it will be like in the actual AP test. They'll have a bunch, they'll tell you to implement a method, they'll have a description, but they'll also have a little example that you can use to answer your own questions about whatever text they might have used to explain. Okay, so I think I know what the problem is supposed to be now. So let's do this same stuff. I'm going to make a new array list, which I will be returning at the end. Only this time, I'm going to start looping at start, and I'm going to loop all the way up to end, but I am including the end index. And I'll say, heck, I'll get the number out first. So sample.getI gets out the number, and then I'll say return sample.add num. And now that's adding the number, and then I'm returning it at the end. And I think that is everything that needs to happen. Let's just double check. Yep, looks good to me. Okay, something to notice is I'm not including any input checking here. I'm not verifying that this number is actually smaller than that number. I'm not verifying that this actually has values. And the reason I'm not is because you can assume that the description in the Java doc, this is the Java doc up here, is correct. So here we're saying the precondition is that the sample contains at least one value, and that means we're assuming that this contains at least one value, so we don't have to check to make sure that's true. All right, I think that's it. I hope this has helped.